Before we dive into this episode, we want to let you know where you can download all the episodes of this podcast, historyasithappens.com. It's a podcast for people who want to think about current events historically. And now, History as It Happens, October 5th, 2021, our First Scourge.
This is not about freedom or personal choice. It's about protecting yourself and those around you, the people you work with, the people you care about, the people you love. My job as president is to protect all Americans.
About 240 years before President Biden announced vaccine requirements to fight COVID-19, General George Washington made every soldier in the Continental Army undergo a smallpox inoculation during one of the worst pandemics of the 18th century. It spread across the continent, killing at least 130,000 people during the Revolutionary War. How did people cope? How did they survive? That's next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
Soldiers trying to march through knee-deep snow. They're covered with smallpox. I can't fathom how they did it. As they retreat up the St. Lawrence River and then down to Lake Champlain, and there are terrible accounts of men in the throes of smallpox, covered with lice and maggots, dying in American encampments as they retreated from Quebec.
If you're ever asked which historical era you'd like to live in, there's really only one answer, one sane answer. Now, today. And why is that? Simple. Penicillin, modern medicine, vaccines, indoor plumbing. Life expectancy in the colonial era was around 35 or 40. Death was everywhere in the form of diseases we today don't have to worry about. Smallpox among them.
Immunization works.
And that's historian Elizabeth Fenn, author of Pox Americana. Our conversation about the defining event of the late 18th century, in addition to the Revolutionary War, is coming up in a bit. So immunization works. We know this from experience. Every day, hundreds, if not thousands of Americans are dying from COVID-19, almost all of them unvaccinated. It's as if some Americans are like the fictitious people of Iran in Albert Camus' classic The Plague. I read it shortly after the coronavirus pandemic arrived in early 2020, and I still think of these lines from Camus. Everybody knows that pestilences have a way of recurring in the world, yet somehow we find it hard to believe in ones that crash down on our heads from a blue sky. There have been as many plagues as wars in history, yet always plagues and wars take people equally by surprise. Well, that's certainly true of 21st century Americans. I don't know if it's true of 18th century Americans, because they lived or died through one outbreak after another. Smallpox, malaria, yellow fever, diphtheria, measles, scarlet fever, whooping cough. And in 1775, a terrible smallpox epidemic began. It wound up killing more people than were killed in combat during the Revolutionary War by a wide margin. Yet it seems lost in popular memory. We should know more about it, considering how significant it was, especially for Native American peoples who inhabited the vast North American continent as the little battles erupted at Lexington and Concord. So let's learn about it with Elizabeth Fenn, historian at the University of Colorado Boulder. She studies the early American West, focusing on epidemic disease, Native American, and environmental history. And she is the author of, as mentioned, Pox Americana, the Great Smallpox Epidemic of 1775 to 82. Elizabeth Fenn, we welcome you.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
So before we get to 1775 and the start of the epidemic, I'd like to give our listeners an idea of what life was like across the 18th century for the average person. Disease outbreaks were constant: smallpox, measles, yellow fever. You're an expert on the history of epidemic disease, so talk about what the climate was like.
Well, we certainly had a robust infectious disease environment. You know, the first smallpox epidemic took place in 1520-21 in central Mexico. First smallpox epidemic in the Americas, I should say, with Cortez's conquest of the Mexica or Aztec people. And thereafter, in the century that followed, epidemics just exploded out of central Mexico. They're sometimes hard to identify in the historical record, but they would have included measles, influenza, chickenpox, colds, maybe plague, maybe malaria, yellow fever, all new infections imported from Europe, Africa, and Asia, infections that had never been seen before in the Americas. The list of epidemics that afflicted North America after Columbus's voyage would be too long to read in this podcast. It's just relentless. And it took a particular toll on Native peoples. I believe it did more to conquer Native peoples than any European superiority in military terms or other aspects of European society and culture did. I don't think there's any particular superiority, but infectious disease took a terrible toll.
Well, you're not alone among scholars when it comes to that conclusion. So one of the first bad smallpox outbreaks of the 18th century takes place in Boston. In 1721, more than 800 people died. And this is when Cotton Mather urges a physician to treat people with something called variolation, based on what an enslaved man had told Mather. What was variolation? What happened there?
That word variolation derives from the name of the smallpox virus, which is variola. We have multiple strains, variola major, variola minor. For the most part, we're talking about variola major, more severe form in the 18th century. So what happened was that Cotton Mather was a slaveholder. He had an African man named Onesimus who had been given to him by his congregation. And of course, an enslaved person who had smallpox, which is a disease that confers immunity. Once you've had it, you'll never get it again. So an enslaved person who had smallpox was actually more valuable than an enslaved person who had not had smallpox. So he asked Onesimus, he said, "Onesimus, have you ever had smallpox?" And Onesimus looks at him and says, "Yes and no." And Mather writes this down in his diary. And then Onesimus went on to describe this procedure his father had put him through in West Africa before Onesimus was captured and transported across the Atlantic Ocean in the slave trade. What his father had done was scratch an incision in his little boy's arm, implanted live pustular matter from another smallpox victim into that sore, wrapped it up. Onesimus, as a child, came down with smallpox. He survived, and you are more likely to survive as a child, garnered immunity, and was thereafter immune as an adult. And that procedure is known as variolation. Europeans learned about variolation from Africa, from Asia, and from the Middle East.
So did variolation work in Boston in 1721?
Well, it was very controversial. It's the first time it was implemented at a large scale in the Americas, and it was immensely controversial because it seemed to many that this was intervening in God's will, that if you were meant to have smallpox, then so be it. You should not intervene to prevent it. It was God should determine this. So many,
it's a morbid way of looking at the world.
many people opposed it. Cotton Mather's house was actually firebombed in the course of the controversy. But inoculation worked. Variola major has a case fatality rate of probably 30 to 40%. Inoculated smallpox or variolation has a case fatality rate of, say, 3 to 5%. Now, that would be absolutely unacceptable to us today, to have an immunization procedure with a 3 to 5% case fatality rate. I mean, just imagine. But if catching smallpox the natural way is a near certainty, variolation seems like a pretty good option.
Did people sign up to get this, or did they have to be forced to undergo this process?
A little bit of both. It tended to be expensive because 18th century medicine was still immersed in humoral theory, and people went through a very complicated preparation process, drinking calomel, mercury, salivating, eating only white-colored foods and things like that. So you basically go into isolation for 4 to 6 weeks. And you had to be wealthy to afford this. Inoculators themselves charged a fair sum of money, so the poor could not afford it. And this is one of the reasons it was controversial in some of the colonies. So wealthy people would undergo variolation, and generally it was less accessible to the poor.
Did people have an idea of what was happening to them? Did they understand how diseases pass from one person to another?
People probably understood smallpox better than any other disease at this time because the chain of contagion was so clear. You contract smallpox by being in the presence of a person with smallpox. Nobody would see a virus until the 20th century, but the contagious nature of this disease was clear, and so too was its pathology, its evolution over the course of the experience, the sequence of symptoms that you would live through. So people did understand this disease quite well. Now, I would argue that in some respects, the poor were better off because they couldn't afford medical care. So they wouldn't have to go through the horrendous bleeding that Benjamin Rush put people through during the Philadelphia yellow fever epidemic of 1793. So in that respect, the poor would be better. But they didn't have resources, the financial resources to, say, cover food expenses and all when they're sick, which is exactly the kind of problem that we're dealing with today. So to that extent, variolation was the prerogative of the wealthy. The poor had little access. The poor often resented the well-to-do for becoming variolated because there is a problem with variolation. And that is that you come down with smallpox. You can communicate the disease. So in some senses, you are as likely to start an epidemic with this procedure as you are to stop one.
That's amazing. As you were answering that question, I thought of how people today still believe in quack medicine. Some people today still believe in quack medicine, whether it's taking ivermectin, which is for parasites or what have you. But we can return to our current dilemma at some point. 1775, about 2.5–3 million people living in the colonies. Many of them are enslaved, and that number does not count, of course, Native American peoples. Life expectancy, from what I gather, was about 40 years old for a white male. There were no major cities, right? They were just towns, large towns in the United States, or the colonies, I should say. Most people didn't travel very far from home during the course of their entire life. And then in 1775, another smallpox outbreak. But this one is the worst one anyone had experienced, right?
So I would differ a little bit with your characterization in that we had some major cities, Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Charleston are all major cities by the time of the American Revolution. And I think that when we talk about the size of the population, we can't exclude Native Americans. So I think your characterization of, say, 2.5 million people in the colonies, and that includes New Spain and Canada, is about right. But then there are another 2.5 million Native Americans. And the reason I think that's important is because smallpox does not select among people. If you are vulnerable to it, it doesn't matter whether you're Native American or European American or African American. If you are vulnerable, you are vulnerable. So I like to think of 5 million people living in the entire continent with surprising mobility. And one of the things that's so interesting about infectious disease and mapping it is that it shows how surprisingly mobile people were in the 18th century. Even at the time of contact with Native Americans, there are these robust trade networks that span the entire continent. And epidemic disease moved through those trade networks well in advance of European and African colonizers. It reaches the center of the continent well before colonizers themselves do. We see the trappings of Europe and Africa in the form of infectious disease.
Well, thank you for clarifying and correcting me there. That's why I have historians on this podcast. Yeah, the population of Boston, 1770, was about 15,000 people. So you're right, that is a large city for its time. And is that where the epidemic began in 1775 as the American Revolution is getting underway in Boston?
Smallpox had been kind of lurking in the background in the Boston area. There are small outbreaks in 1774. But then in 1775, during the siege of Boston, in the aftermath of Lexington and Concord, American troops surrounded the city of Boston, and the British were trapped in the city of Boston with the residents. And smallpox erupted in the city of Boston where the British were besieged. And George Washington arrived, took command of the troops, and became very concerned that smallpox would spread out of Boston and infect his army. And his concerns were legitimate. He was particularly concerned that the British might deliberately infect his army and use biological warfare.
And at this time, smallpox was endemic in Europe. So the British troops who may have been bringing it over with them, they had immunity to it, but Americans didn't.
That is correct. Smallpox was endemic in the major cities of Europe. So if you were born and raised in a European city, you were likely to contract smallpox as a child, which meant you were more likely to survive it too. And assuming you did survive it, you would garner immunity and be immune as an adult. And so what this meant in terms of the American Revolution is that there was differential immunity between British troops, for the most part, born and raised in Europe, and loyalists are a different matter entirely, and American troops born and raised in the Americas, where smallpox was not yet endemic and where you were not yet likely to be exposed to this disease as a child. So the Continental Army, George Washington's army, I'm generalizing here, was vulnerable to smallpox, and the British Army was not.
And in your book, Pox Americana, I love that title, Washington, he didn't believe it when he first received intelligence that the British were considering germ warfare, dipping arrows in smallpox and firing them at his men. He didn't believe this?
Initially, he heard some rumors and reports that the British might try to infect his army, and he just deemed it beyond comprehension. Then he got some countervailing evidence. Refugees allowed to leave Boston by the British High Command came down with smallpox as they arrived amid the American troops, which suggested they might have been deliberately infected probably 12 days earlier. So that's the incubation period in an attempt to infect the Continental Army. When this happened, Washington implemented a very strict quarantine. Anybody with the slightest symptoms of smallpox was to be quarantined because he knew how much damage this could do to his army because he had had smallpox.
Yeah, let's talk about that. He had it as a young man, right?
Yeah, in the year 1751, Washington is 19 years old. He took a trip to Barbados with his older half-brother, Lawrence Washington. Ironically, the reason for their trip to Barbados was to alleviate Lawrence Washington's persistent cough, congested lungs, which were symptoms of the consumption or tuberculosis that would eventually kill Lawrence. So they arrive in Barbados, and ironically, it's George who takes sick. George comes down with smallpox. He takes to his bed, doesn't write it in his journal for a whole month. And he was an assiduous journalist, shows you how sick he was, and he survived. So the point I want to make, though, is that he understood how this incapacitates you, and he understood how it could incapacitate his forces if it began to spread among them.
People dreaded the pox, right? They called it the pox. And at this early stage of the war, clearly Washington was already concerned about what it might do to his army. So how does the smallpox situation in Boston get resolved? I assume that it didn't end there, that smallpox didn't stay contained to the city.
It stayed contained to the city until the British withdrew their troops. And then, as you can imagine, people outside the city go flooding into the city to visit friends, catch up with family. The circulation of human beings and their microbes just explodes. And so did smallpox in the summer of 1776 after the British withdrawal. This is the summer of 1776. Right? People are going to readings of the Declaration of Independence. The world is afire. And smallpox was afire as well in the city of Boston. It took until late in the fall for the epidemic in Boston to resolve itself. But in the meantime, there was another outbreak of smallpox among the American forces that were besieging Quebec, which proved to be quite catastrophic.
That's right. One of the first decisions Washington made after he assumed overall command of the Continental Army was to invade Canada. And that mission was wrecked by smallpox, not necessarily the British.
I would make that case. American troops besieged the British-held city of Quebec in the winter of 1775, 1776, and smallpox took hold in the American encampment outside Quebec. It really wreaked havoc among the troops who needed reinforcements quite desperately. But what would happen is reinforcements would arrive from the South, and just like most Americans, they were vulnerable to smallpox. So it was like adding fuel to the fire. The reinforcements, in some respects, became a liability. So that when the British reinforcements arrived in the spring of 1776, the American camp was riddled with smallpox and they fled in desperation. And there are horrific accounts of soldiers trying to march through knee-deep snow. They're covered with smallpox. I can't fathom how they did it as they retreat up the St. Lawrence River and then down to Lake Champlain. And there are terrible accounts of men in the throes of smallpox, covered with lice and maggots, dying in American encampments as they retreated from Quebec.
Does not sound like a glorious way to go. You mentioned quarantine before. At this period, there's basically two ways to deal with smallpox: isolation or quarantine, or inoculation. And ultimately, General Washington decides he has to inoculate his army to save it from smallpox. And I suppose this is the part of the story that most resonates with our current dilemma as Americans compare mask mandates and vaccine orders to tyranny. I suppose George Washington was a tyrant in this respect, although that is probably overstating the case. So why don't you take us through his decision-making process when it came to inoculations?
Well, first, let me back up a little bit and return to Quebec, because initially at Quebec, many of the troops wanted to be variolated. They sought inoculation because the smallpox ripping through camp around them was quite terrifying. And the command at Quebec refused to allow inoculation. And some men actually did it on the sly. And they did it sometimes by sticking needles under their fingernails that were infected with pustular matter. So it became very controversial. Ethan Allen actually called his men aside and said, I'm not telling you to violate orders, but if you're going to inoculate yourself, do it in a place where they won't find the inoculation site. Do it on your thigh, which won't be visible, so you won't get caught protecting yourself against this disease. Now, later on, in 1777 and 1778, Washington decided that the risks of smallpox to his army were so great that he needed to inoculate everyone. He made this policy. He did not come to that decision easily. He actually decided once and then backed off a bit. But by the winter of 1777 and 1778, the famous Valley Forge winter, variolation was policy for his enlisted men.
So what was he most concerned about? Civil liberties, to borrow a modern phrase, or was it the practicality of it? After all, it was a large undertaking, inoculating all the soldiers. Or was it the risk factor, as you described? You had to actually give someone the smallpox to inoculate them. What were his concerns?
I don't think he was concerned about civil liberties. I think he was concerned about two things. When you undergo variolation, you come down with smallpox. And he knew that putting his whole army through this would basically incapacitate his whole army. Right? And if the British got wind of what was going on, they might take advantage. So when this policy was adopted, they kept it a secret as best they could. So that's the first thing he was worried about. The second thing he was worried about is that, variolation confers the smallpox infection. What if it escaped his camps? What if it began to circulate widely among local civilians? Well, today we would say those would be bad optics.
He'd be a super spreader.
Yes, he would be a super spreader. And that's something that distinguishes variolation or inoculation from the vaccines we have today, which don't spread in most cases. an infection. I mean, polio vaccine would be an exception to that, but yeah.
Yet some people today believe that the COVID-19 vaccine gives you the virus or plants microchips in you. I don't know. So Washington essentially saves his army. He does it. It works, right?
Yeah, he does it, and it works. After the winter of 1777, 1778, smallpox was no longer a major threat to the American troops. It's not to say they didn't have outbreaks among militia units who were not enlisted men. Smallpox continued to be a problem. Smallpox actually continued to be a problem for British militia units, for loyalist militias. Once again, they're Americans. They haven't been exposed to the virus. So it continued to be a player in the war, but American troops were, for the most part, protected.
The epidemic ends in 1783. So the epidemic continues on for several more years. You estimated that it killed at least 130,000 people because it travels west and devastates indigenous peoples, right?
It does. It circulates broadly in the South, in the Southern theater of the war, but it's not a huge player in events there. And then it breaks out in Mexico City, and it wreaks havoc. It kills 18,000 people in Mexico City alone. And it begins then to move south into South America. That's a book that's yet to be written. And it also moves north. It kills like 30,000 people in Guanajuato. And you can use Spanish mission records to trace its movement all the way to Texas, New Mexico, California. It spreads north through Native American trade networks across the plains. It afflicts Comanches, Kiowas, Arapahoes, Arikaras, Mandans, Hidatzas, Blackfeet, Lakotas. I mean, I could just go on and on and on. It was a horrific epidemic. It reaches Hudson Bay. And eventually it descends the Columbia River and wreaks havoc on the coast of the Northwest and even as far north as Alaska.
Wow. This seems like a forgotten chapter in history, how this epidemic shattered those tribes.
I think it is. And it's a forgotten dimension to the story of these years, which we think of rightfully as the years of the American Revolution. And I don't want to pretend that the revolution is not important. But frankly, for most people across the continent, smallpox was the common experience of these years.
Yeah, I get the sense, even from my own reading of history, that the epidemic doesn't get enough attention, you know what I mean? For how important it was, we don't know enough about it. And for the people, such as the Native American tribes of the West, who live far from the Revolutionary War battlefields, the epidemic had to be the defining event of that decade.
I think that's the case. Looking backward, we can see how important the revolution was for the continent in anticipation of the westward expansion of British Americans, Anglo-Americans, right? But at the time, the most salient event for most people was epidemic smallpox. And that epidemic absolutely shaped what those westward moving Anglo-Americans would encounter as they arrived on the Missouri River. As Lewis and Clark make their journey to the mouth of the Columbia River, everything they encountered had been shaped by that disease. At least all the human populations they encountered were shaped by that disease.
And it spread so quickly. You touched on this before, but it spread so quickly because you could be walking around with it for a while, not even know you had it, right?
Yeah, we haven't talked about the symptoms and pathology of smallpox, which probably deserves a little bit of attention. Smallpox is a virus. Generally, it's contracted by direct exposure to a sick individual. It has approximately 12-day incubation period. It might be 13, might be 14, might be 10. And
it's a long time.
It's a long time. And I will say, this is important, it's an asymptomatic, non-contagious incubation period, which means you're not spreading the virus as you move around. But then when you become symptomatic, which usually happens first with classic fever, malaise, backache, just that generalized kind of influenza feeling, until suddenly pustules erupt in your mouth and your nasal passages, and then you become phenomenally contagious. And eventually the pustules erupt over your entire body. The nature of the rash pretty much determines the outcome. If the rash becomes confluent, where all the sores run into one another, odds are pretty good you're going to die. If they stay discrete or separate, your chances of living are much, much better. But that 12-day incubation period is really important because you could cover a lot of ground, even in the 1700s, in 12 days. I mean, get in a canoe or a bullboat on the Missouri River and travel for 12 days, and you will have covered hundreds of miles. Likewise for a sailing ship along the Atlantic coastline or the Gulf Coast.
I want to wrap up with Edward Jenner, but I need to ask you a question about another group of people we really haven't discussed yet in depth that were ravaged by smallpox, and that would be enslaved people. The disease devastated this group of people, didn't it?
It did. So enslaved people were vulnerable or immune to smallpox in the same patterns that Anglo-Americans were. So if you had been born in Africa and transported across the Atlantic, you might have gone through variolation as a child in Africa, and you might have immunity. But thereafter, everybody born and raised in the Americas, including African Americans, was vulnerable. And early in the war, there was an episode in which a British governor of Virginia, a man named Lord Dunmore, actually issued America's first Emancipation Proclamation. It's called Dunmore's Proclamation. He implemented that diplomatic strategy by which my enemy's enemy is my friend, and he promised freedom to African Americans in Virginia who belonged to patriots and who were willing to fight on the British side. Hundreds upon hundreds of people fled to Lord Dunmore. Hundreds of African Americans took their own liberty and fled to Lord Dunmore. And unfortunately, smallpox infected his troops, his black troops. They endured horrific suffering as a consequence. Later on, in 1780 and 81, in the Southern theater of the Revolutionary War, again, African Americans were particularly vulnerable. The British promise of freedom continued. And as Lord Cornwallis, leading the British troops through the South, made his way through the Carolinas and Virginia, thousands, I should say, of African Americans took their own liberty, and they too succumbed to smallpox in huge numbers. They didn't go through the variolation that Washington's troops had gone through.
What a cruel irony there about Dunmore's proclamation, because it did not apply to the slaves of loyalists, and those brave enslaved people who fled wound up getting smallpox.
Yeah. It's a dimension of the American Revolution that just has not penetrated the popular mindset. 30,000 enslaved Virginians fled during the American Revolution. That's mind-blowing. That is a slave rebellion, if you will, of incomprehensible proportions.
And I believe some of them were George Washington's.
Indeed, they were.
He wasn't happy about that.
And Thomas Jefferson's.
So I don't know if there's a happy ending to this horrible story, but Edward Jenner does develop a smallpox vaccine in the 1790s, right? Who was Edward Jenner, and how did he do this?
So Edward Jenner was an English country doctor. He had observed that milkmaids, women who milked cows for a living, tended not to get smallpox. And he hypothesized that the reason for that was that milkmaids contracted cowpox. And he thought maybe that somehow confers immunity to smallpox. So Jenner undertook an experiment that would never be approved by an IRB board today. He found a little boy, 9 years old, I believe. Last name is Phipps, James Phipps, perhaps. And he somehow got his mother's approval for doing an experiment. And what he did was infect this little boy with cowpox, let the cowpox run its course. Cowpox is kind of like smallpox. You can confer it by scratching a sore into somebody's hand or arm and implanting gross stuff into the sore. And so the little boy lived through cowpox, and then Jenner tried to infect him with smallpox, and he could not get the infection to take. This was a revelation. Cowpox confers immunity to smallpox. They're in the same family of viruses. And this was our first vaccine. There's a famous British historian named Macaulay has said it was as though the angels' trumpets had sounded.
I'm wondering how long it took to get this vaccine into circulation, and if people, like they did with polio in the 1950s, flocked to get it because this was freedom from a horrible disease.
So Jenner did his experiment in 1796. He published his account of it in 1798, and people did indeed flock to undergo this procedure. That does not mean it wasn't controversial. You can find the roots of an anti-vaccination movement right then. In 1798, there's some wonderful British cartoons of people undergoing vaccination, with a cow, and they were sprouting udders and cow body parts and so on. But it was truly a medical revelation. There is a wonderful Spanish account of a man named Balmis who actually organized an attempt to send vaccination to the Spanish colonies in the Americas via a shipload of orphan boys. And they implanted the cowpox in one little boy's arm, and then in the next, to transfer the cowpox vaccination across the Atlantic Ocean, and then even into the Pacific. It was a revelation.
So, final question, Elizabeth Fenn. What's the lesson to glean from this episode, 1775 to 1783, as we today grapple with the coronavirus, despite having a vaccine that many people are resisting?
I think I would answer that in just 2 words, which is to say that immunization works.
Elizabeth Fenn, we thank you for your work and your book, Pox Americana. On the next episode of History as It Happens, Columbus Day is around the corner. So how did a genuine navigator become an American hero?
If you're going to write about a historical figure, there's nobody who's more interesting or difficult to start with than Columbus, because we know so much about him, and yet there's so much which is misunderstood.
Columbus is remembered as a mythic hero who discovered America. He's also remembered as a genocidal racist. Maybe neither's true. That's next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.